The extraordinary and deeply moving story I'm about to share with you today began on a crisp autumn Wednesday morning in late September, precisely at 8 o'clock, when golden sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a luxurious penthouse apartment located on the 40th floor of the most exclusive residential tower in the entire metropolitan area. When Isabella Rodriguez arrived punctually for her first day working as private tutor and educational consultant to the troubled 13-year-old son of Leonardo Santos, a 49-year-old investment banking executive who had accumulated vast wealth through decades of aggressive financial strategies and 70-hour work weeks, but who had completely failed to build any meaningful relationship with his only child or to create a home environment that felt nurturing and supportive rather than cold and transactional. Isabella was 35 years old with intelligent gray-green eyes that seemed to see through superficial appearances directly into people's hearts and motivations, auburn hair that fell in natural waves to her shoulders, and a presence that combined quiet confidence with genuine warmth in ways that made even suspicious defensive people feel safe enough to lower their protective walls and show their authentic selves. She carried a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her late father, who had been a professor of literature and philosophy before his death from heart disease when Isabella was just completing her undergraduate degree. And inside that satchel were carefully chosen books and materials and small, meaningful objects that she might use to connect with her new student, whose name was Gabriel, and who, according to the brief information Leonardo had provided during their initial phone interview, was struggling academically and behaviorally following his parents' bitter divorce 2 years ago and his mother's subsequent remarriage and relocation to another country where she now lived with her new husband and their infant daughter. Gabriel had been shuffled between households during the divorce proceedings, before ultimately being placed in his father's custody by default, because his mother didn't feel capable of managing a troubled preteen while adjusting to her new marriage and dealing with an unexpected late-in-life pregnancy, though the painful reality that everyone carefully avoided acknowledging directly was that Gabriel's mother had essentially abandoned him by choosing her new life over maintaining close relationship with her first child. Leonardo Santos had hired Isabella after an exhaustive search and multiple failed attempts with other tutors and educational therapists who had either quit in frustration after a few weeks or had been dismissed by Leonardo for failing to produce the immediate dramatic improvements he demanded with the same impatience he brought to business negotiations, where delays and complications were simply unacceptable obstacles to be eliminated through force of will and sufficient application of money. The agency that placed Isabella had warned her explicitly that this was an extremely challenging position with a difficult, demanding employer and a traumatized child who had learned to protect himself through hostility and academic sabotage. But Isabella had accepted the position anyway because she desperately needed the generous salary Leonardo was offering, and because she genuinely believed, based on decades of experience working with struggling students, that every child could be reached and helped if you approached them with sufficient patience and creativity and unconditional positive regard rather than judgment and pressure. What Leonardo didn't know, and what Isabella had very carefully not disclosed during her interview, was that she was struggling with her own profound personal crisis that had consumed her life for the past 18 months and that made her current financial and professional situation precarious in ways that would have alarmed any employer who knew the full truth. Isabella's younger sister Carolina, who was only 28 years old, and the person Isabella loved most in the entire world, had been diagnosed with an aggressive and treatment-resistant form of lupus that had progressively destroyed her kidneys and required regular dialysis treatments 3 times per week, while she waited desperately on a transplant list for a kidney donation that might never come given the shortage of available organs and the complexity of finding suitable matches. The medical expenses were absolutely devastating, despite the basic health insurance coverage Carolina had through her low-paying job as a social worker, and Isabella had exhausted her savings and taken out high-interest loans and even borrowed money from friends trying to cover the endless costs of treatments and medications and specialists, while also supporting Carolina emotionally and practically, since their parents had died years ago and they had no other family to turn to for help. Isabella had been working as a teacher at an expensive private school before Carolina's diagnosis, a position she had loved and excelled at for nearly a decade. But she had been forced to resign when Carolina's health deteriorated to the point where she needed someone available for emergency hospital trips and dialysis appointments, and the constant medical crisis management that made holding a traditional teaching job with fixed hours and limited flexibility completely impossible. She had been surviving financially since then through a patchwork of private tutoring positions and online teaching gigs that paid decently but offered no benefits or job security, and she was barely managing to keep them housed and fed, while the medical debt continued mounting to levels that felt completely insurmountable and hopeless. The position with Leonardo represented not just significantly higher pay than her other tutoring work, but also the possibility of relative stability if she could manage to keep the job long enough to get their financial situation under some semblance of control and potentially save enough to help cover Carolina's expenses when the hoped-for transplant opportunity finally arrived. When Isabella entered the penthouse apartment that first morning, after being buzzed up by the building's stern-faced doorman, who looked at her modest clothing and beat-up car with obvious skepticism about whether she really belonged in this exclusive building, she was immediately struck by the stunning views through enormous windows that offered panoramic cityscapes, but also by the complete absence of any warmth or personality or evidence that actual human beings lived in this showcase of expensive modern furniture and designer decor. The living spaces looked like photographs from an architecture magazine rather than a home where a father and son shared daily life, with everything impeccably clean and organized but utterly sterile and cold, with no family photographs displayed anywhere, no comfortable worn furniture that invited relaxation, no books or games or art projects or any other signs of a child's presence and interests. It felt more like a luxury hotel suite than a family home, and Isabella's heart immediately ached for the boy who was supposed to be growing up in this beautiful but emotionally empty space. Leonardo was waiting in his home office when Isabella arrived, sitting behind a massive desk with multiple computer screens displaying financial data and market information, dressed in an expensive tailored suit despite working from home that day, every detail of his appearance controlled and perfect, from his precisely styled silver-streaked black hair to his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Isabella earned in a month. He glanced up from his screens long enough to give Isabella a brief appraising look and a curt nod before launching immediately into his expectations and requirements without bothering with pleasantries or getting-to-know-you conversation. He explained in a tone that suggested he was used to giving orders and having them followed without question that Gabriel was failing multiple subjects at his expensive private school, despite clearly having above-average intelligence, that he was a discipline problem who was disruptive and disrespectful to teachers and frequently got into conflicts with other students, that previous tutors had failed to make any meaningful progress in addressing either the academic performance issues or the behavioral problems. Leonardo emphasized that he expected Isabella to produce measurable results quickly because he didn't have time or patience for therapeutic approaches or building rapport or any of what he dismissively called touchy-feely education theory that prioritized feelings over actual learning and achievement. He wanted Gabriel's grades brought up to acceptable levels, he wanted the behavioral reports from school to improve dramatically, and he wanted this accomplished through whatever methods Isabella deemed necessary, including strict discipline and consequences and removal of privileges if positive reinforcement approaches proved insufficient. He made clear that Gabriel spent too much time on video games and YouTube and other digital entertainment that Leonardo viewed as worthless distractions from serious academic work, and that part of Isabella's job would be enforcing strict limits on screen time and ensuring Gabriel devoted adequate hours to studying and homework completion. At no point during this entire monologue did Leonardo express any emotional concern about his son's well-being or happiness or the underlying causes of his struggles. treating Gabriel's academic and behavioral problems as purely technical management issues to be solved through application of appropriate pressure and consequences, rather than as symptoms of a traumatized child desperately needing love and stability and someone who actually cared about him as a person. When Leonardo finally finished his instructions and dismissed Isabella to go meet Gabriel with the expectation that tutoring sessions would begin immediately that day, Isabella had to consciously suppress her instinctive reactions of anger and sadness about what she was witnessing in terms of Leonardo's cold, detached parenting approach. She reminded herself that she needed this job desperately and couldn't afford to offend Leonardo by criticizing his parenting or suggesting that maybe his son's problems had more to do with abandonment and emotional neglect than with insufficient academic pressure. And she headed toward Gabriel's bedroom, hoping that at least with the child she could begin building some kind of genuine human connection that might eventually help heal some of his wounds, even if she couldn't change his father's fundamental approach. Gabriel's bedroom was surprisingly different from the sterile perfection of the rest of the apartment, clearly representing space where Leonardo didn't bother to impose his rigid control and where Gabriel had been allowed to create his own environment. The room was messy, but not filthy, with clothes and books and papers scattered around, posters of various bands and video game characters covering the walls, a desk piled high with electronics and gaming equipment, and most tellingly, a small shrine-like arrangement on a bookshelf that featured photographs of Gabriel with his mother during happier times before the divorce, along with small mementos and objects that clearly held emotional significance, though they appeared to have been deliberately hidden partially behind other items, as if Gabriel was ashamed of his continued attachment to a mother who had essentially abandoned him. Isabella knocked gently on the partially open door and waited for permission to enter rather than just barging in, and she heard a sullen teenage voice grunt what might have been assent, or might have been just acknowledgement of her presence. Gabriel was sprawled on his bed, playing on his phone when Isabella entered, and he didn't bother looking up or acknowledging her beyond that initial grunt, clearly demonstrating through his body language and studied indifference that he had no interest in cooperating with yet another tutor his father had hired, and that he expected this interaction to follow the same pattern as all the others, where adults would try to force him to care about school and follow rules and conform to expectations. That felt completely meaningless, given that nobody actually seemed to care about what he wanted or needed or felt. Isabella didn't react to his rudeness or immediately start lecturing him about respect or try to establish authority through demands and consequences like previous tutors had apparently done based on the extensive notes she had reviewed from the agency. Instead, she simply introduced herself warmly and honestly, saying that her name was Isabella and she was going to be working with him on academics, but that before they got into any of that, she would really appreciate if he could help her understand what his actual interests and concerns were, because she genuinely wanted to help him, rather than just being another adult making demands and judgments without caring about his perspective. Gabriel looked up from his phone with obvious surprise at this approach, and Isabella could see him trying to assess whether this was some new manipulation strategy or whether she might actually mean what she was saying. She held his gaze calmly and waited without pushing or demanding. And after a long moment, Gabriel sat up slightly and asked in a voice that tried to sound aggressive, but couldn't quite hide the vulnerability underneath why she should be any different from all the other tutors and therapists and teachers who claimed they wanted to help, but really just wanted to fix him and make him act normal and stop causing problems for adults who didn't want to deal with his feelings or needs. Isabella answered thoughtfully and truthfully, saying that she couldn't promise she would be different or better than everyone else, but that she could promise to actually listen and try to understand rather than just judging and imposing solutions, that she had her own experience with grief and loss and struggling to function when life felt overwhelming, so she wasn't approaching him as someone perfect who had all the answers, but rather as a fellow imperfect human who believed everyone deserved compassion and support, especially during the hardest times. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression when Isabella mentioned grief and loss, and he asked guardedly what she meant by that, and whether she was just making up stories to manipulate him into trusting her. Isabella made a split-second decision to share something real and vulnerable, rather than maintaining professional distance, calculating that this wounded, suspicious child needed to see authentic humanity from her if she had any hope of breaking through his defensive walls. She told him honestly that her younger sister was seriously ill and fighting for her life, that watching someone you love suffer and being unable to fix it or make it better was absolutely devastating and made everything else in life feel trivial and meaningless, that she understood what it felt like when people expected you to just carry on normally and care about things like homework and grades when your world was falling apart and nobody seemed to understand or care about your real pain. She said she wasn't comparing her situation to his because everyone's grief and loss was unique and personal, but that she wanted him to know she had some understanding of what it felt like to be struggling emotionally while everyone around you focused only on behavioral problems and academic performance rather than acknowledging that maybe you were hurting too much to function normally. Gabriel stared at Isabella for a long moment with an expression that suggested he was deciding something important. And then he did something that apparently he hadn't done with any of the previous tutors or therapists, according to the notes Isabella had reviewed. He started actually talking about his feelings and his mother and how much it hurt that she had chosen her new perfect family over him, how angry he was at his father for caring more about business than about spending time with him, how lonely he felt living in this beautiful apartment that felt like a prison where nobody actually saw or knew or cared about who he really was beyond being a problem to be managed and fixed. The words came out in a rush like they had been building up under enormous pressure for months or years, and Isabella listened without interrupting or correcting or offering premature reassurance, just being fully present with his pain and acknowledging that what he was feeling made complete sense given what he had experienced. They talked for nearly 2 hours that first day without ever opening a textbook or discussing academic subjects, just building the foundation of trust and genuine human connection that Isabella knew was absolutely essential before any meaningful educational work could happen with a child who had shut down emotionally and academically as a form of self-protection. When their time was up and Isabella prepared to leave with plans to return the next day, Gabriel surprised her by saying thank you in a quiet voice that suggested he actually meant it, rather than just performing expected politeness, and he asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether she would really come back or whether, after hearing how messed up he was, she would decide like everyone else that he was too difficult and not worth the effort. Isabella looked him directly in the eyes and promised sincerely that she would absolutely be back and that she didn't think he was messed up at all, but rather was a normal human being having completely understandable reactions to extremely difficult circumstances, and that she was committed to working with him not because his father was paying her, but because she genuinely believed he deserved support, and she would do everything she could to help him however she could. Over the following weeks and months, Isabella worked patiently and creatively to help Gabriel not just academically, but emotionally and socially, recognizing that his school performance issues were symptoms of deeper problems that needed to be addressed holistically rather than through narrow focus on just grades and test scores. She helped him develop better organizational systems and study strategies that actually matched his learning style rather than forcing him to conform to approaches that didn't work for his brain. She found ways to connect academic content to his genuine interests in music and gaming and technology rather than treating school as something completely separate from real life. And most importantly, she consistently showed up and kept her promises and demonstrated through actions rather than just words that she actually cared about him as a person and wasn't going to disappear or give up on him even when progress was slow or when he occasionally lapsed back into defensive hostility. Leonardo initially seemed pleased with the visible improvements in Gabriel's grades and the reduction in negative behavior reports from school, and he increased Isabella's hours and responsibilities to include not just academic tutoring, but also serving as a kind of educational consultant and family liaison, helping manage Gabriel's school relationships and extracurricular activities. But Leonardo remained emotionally distant from the actual work of parenting beyond writing checks and imposing rules, still spending most of his time focused on business and treating his home as just a place to sleep and occasionally eat, rather than a space to actually connect with his son. Isabella tried multiple times to engage Leonardo in conversations about Gabriel's emotional needs and the importance of father-son relationship beyond just providing material support. But Leonardo consistently deflected or minimized these concerns, while making clear that he had hired Isabella to handle the educational and developmental issues so he could focus on his work, which was how he contributed to the family by ensuring their financial security and lifestyle. The crisis that would eventually crack Leonardo's defensive walls and force genuine change came approximately 4 months after Isabella started working with the family. On a Friday evening when Isabella received an emergency call from the hospital where Carolina had been rushed after collapsing at home, with complications from her lupus that caused sudden kidney failure, requiring immediate intervention. Isabella was at the Santos apartment working with Gabriel when the call came, and she immediately apologized to Gabriel and explained that she had to leave immediately because of her sister's emergency. Gabriel could see the terror and grief in Isabella's eyes despite her attempts to stay composed, and he insisted on telling his father what was happening, even though Leonardo was supposedly in an important business dinner that shouldn't be interrupted. Leonardo came home from the dinner earlier than planned when Gabriel's text messages became increasingly urgent and emotional, arriving to find Gabriel anxiously pacing and asking repeatedly whether Isabella and her sister were going to be okay and whether there was anything they could do to help. Leonardo's initial reaction was irritation at having his dinner interrupted and at the implication that he should do something about Isabella's personal problems when she was an employee he paid generously to do a job, and her family issues were not his responsibility. But something about Gabriel's emotional distress and his desperate pleading that they needed to help Isabella because she had helped them so much, and she was basically the only adult besides his father who actually cared about Gabriel, made Leonardo pause and really look at his son's face and see genuine compassion and concern for someone else's suffering, rather than the sullen, self-absorbed attitude that Gabriel had displayed for years. Leonardo made what was for him an extremely unusual decision, choosing to respond to his son's emotional needs rather than simply dismissing them and returning to his business priorities, and he asked Gabriel to explain what exactly was happening with Isabella's sister and why Gabriel was so concerned. Gabriel told his father everything that Isabella had shared with him over the months about Carolina's illness and the financial devastation it was causing, and Isabella's desperate attempts to save her sister while barely surviving financially herself. Information that Isabella had never shared with Leonardo because she maintained strict professional boundaries and didn't want to burden an employer with personal problems or risk being seen as unreliable or asking for special accommodations. Leonardo listened with growing awareness that he had been completely oblivious to the struggles of someone who spent significant time in his home and had made profound positive impact on his son's life, that he had never bothered to see Isabella as a complete human being with her own challenges and needs and family responsibilities beyond just her function as Gabriel's tutor. He found himself thinking about his own sister who had died from cancer 15 years ago and how devastating that loss had been, and how he had coped by throwing himself even more intensely into work as a way to avoid feeling grief and pain. And he recognized with uncomfortable clarity that he had taught his son through his own example that the appropriate response to emotional difficulty was disconnection and avoidance rather than vulnerability and genuine human connection. Leonardo made a decision in that moment that surprised both himself and Gabriel, announcing that they were going to the hospital to check on Isabella and see if there was anything they could do to help or support her during this crisis. Gabriel looked shocked, but immediately grateful and rushed to get ready while Leonardo made some phone calls to find out which hospital Carolina had been taken to and to arrange for his personal driver to take them there. They arrived at the hospital around 9 in the evening and found Isabella in the ICU waiting room looking absolutely devastated and exhausted, her eyes red from crying and her entire body radiating the kind of helpless anguish that comes from watching someone you love desperately and being completely unable to help them or fix the situation. When Isabella saw Leonardo and Gabriel walking toward her, her first reaction was confusion followed by embarrassment that they were seeing her in such a vulnerable state. But before she could apologize or try to explain, Gabriel rushed forward and hugged her tightly, while saying that they had come to be with her because she shouldn't have to be alone during something this scary and awful. Leonardo stood somewhat awkwardly watching this display of genuine compassion and emotional connection between his son and the tutor, and he realized with a mix of shame and admiration that Gabriel had learned from Isabella's example how to show up for people in crisis with authentic care, rather than just performing hollow social obligations or avoiding emotional complexity altogether. Leonardo sat down next to Isabella in the uncomfortable hospital waiting room chairs and asked quietly what the current situation was and whether there was anything practical he could help with. And Isabella explained through exhausted tears that Carolina was stable for the moment, but that her kidneys had completely failed and she would need dialysis indefinitely unless a transplant could be found soon, that the financial costs were completely overwhelming, and Isabella honestly didn't know how. She was going to manage to pay for everything, especially if Carolina's condition continued deteriorating and requiring more intensive interventions. She apologized for burdening Leonardo with her personal problems and assured him this wouldn't affect her ability to continue working with Gabriel, but Leonardo surprised both Isabella and himself by saying firmly that she shouldn't worry about the job or money right now and should just focus on her sister, and that he would take care of whatever needed to be taken care of to help them through this crisis. Over the following days and weeks, Leonardo demonstrated through concrete actions, rather than just words, that he genuinely intended to help Isabella and Carolina through their medical and financial crisis. He paid all of Carolina's outstanding medical bills and set up arrangements with the hospital to cover all current and future treatment costs, regardless of what insurance did or didn't pay. He hired the best kidney specialists in the country to evaluate Carolina's case and explore all possible treatment options, and most importantly, he used his wealth and connections to get Carolina moved up on the transplant waiting list and to fund a private search for a living donor that might be able to provide a kidney transplant much sooner than waiting for a deceased donor organ to become available. He insisted that all of this was just practical problem-solving and not charity or anything that required elaborate gratitude, deflecting Isabella's attempts to thank him by saying that he had resources he wasn't using for anything meaningful and that helping someone who had helped his son so profoundly was the least he could do, and honestly was more about addressing his own guilt about his privileges and waste than about being generous. But Gabriel understood better than his father consciously acknowledged that something much more significant was happening than just writing checks to solve a problem, that Leonardo was for the first time in years allowing himself to genuinely care about another human being's well-being and to take action motivated by compassion rather than just strategic advantage or social obligation. Gabriel watched his father spending time at the hospital visiting with Carolina and getting to know her as a person rather than just a medical case to be managed, listening to her talk about her work as a social worker, helping other struggling families navigate systems designed to be complicated and exclusionary, learning about her hopes and dreams and fears and the profound gratitude she felt for having a sister like Isabella who had sacrificed so much to try to save her life. Leonardo found himself genuinely moved by Carolina's courage and grace in facing such a devastating illness, by her concern for Isabella's well-being and career despite being the one who was critically ill, by her lack of bitterness or self-pity despite having every reason to rage against the unfairness of a world where someone so young and good could face such terrible suffering. The most dramatic turning point came approximately 6 weeks after Carolina's hospitalization, when Leonardo's private donor search miraculously identified a compatible living donor through a complex kidney exchange program that paired Carolina with a kidney that was perfect match for her specific antibodies and tissue type. The surgery was scheduled quickly before anything could go wrong or the donor could change their mind, and both Leonardo and Gabriel accompanied Isabella to the hospital on the day of Carolina's transplant to wait through the long hours of surgery and provide whatever support and presence they could offer. During that endless waiting period, while surgeons worked to give Carolina a chance at normal life through this transplanted organ, Leonardo and Isabella had the longest, genuine personal conversation they had ever shared, talking about topics far beyond Gabriel's education and needs, and beginning to really know each other as complete human beings rather than just employer and employee. Leonardo shared with Isabella his own history of loss and grief that he had never adequately processed, telling her about his sister's death from cancer and how that experience had led him to close off emotionally and throw himself into work as a way to avoid ever again feeling the kind of devastating pain that came from loving someone and then losing them to circumstances beyond your control. He admitted that he had been a terrible father to Gabriel, not because he didn't love his son, but because he was terrified of getting too close emotionally and then potentially experiencing another devastating loss. So he had unconsciously created distance and treated parenting as just another management challenge rather than a relationship requiring vulnerability and emotional availability. He acknowledged that watching Isabella care for her sister with such devotion, while also showing up consistently for Gabriel despite her own exhaustion and stress, had shown him what genuine love and commitment actually looked like, and that he was ashamed of how he had been living and parenting and treating the people around him as functions rather than as whole human beings deserving respect and connection. Isabella listened to Leonardo's confession with compassion rather than judgment, and she shared her own struggles with balancing her love for her sister against the practical realities of survival and the temptation sometimes to resent the enormous sacrifices and burdens that Carolina's illness had imposed on her life and career and possibilities. She admitted that there were moments when she felt angry at Carolina for being sick, even though that was completely irrational and unfair, angry at the universe for the injustice of her sister suffering when she had done nothing to deserve such a fate, angry at herself for not being able to fix everything and save Carolina through sheer force of will and love. She said that what she had learned through this devastating experience was that you can't control outcomes or guarantee that the people you love will be okay, no matter how hard you try, but that you can control how you show up and whether you choose to be present and caring even when it's hard, and even when there are no guarantees, and even when vulnerability means risking the kind of pain that comes from potentially losing someone who matters deeply to you. Leonardo found himself profoundly moved by Isabella's honesty and wisdom, and he realized that he had developed feelings for her that went far beyond professional respect or gratitude for what she had done for Gabriel, that he was falling in love with this remarkable woman who had somehow seen through all his defensive walls and wealth and power to the scared, lonely person underneath, and had treated him with kindness and challenged him to be better, without being judgmental or manipulative. He didn't say any of this during that hospital waiting room conversation because the timing was completely wrong, when Isabella was focused on her sister's survival and needed support, rather than having to navigate romantic complications. But he recognized what he was feeling and accepted that this was going to change things between them eventually, whether or not it was convenient or comfortable. Carolina's transplant surgery was successful, and her recovery over the following months was remarkably smooth, with no major complications or rejection episodes. A small miracle that felt almost too good to be true after so many months and years of devastating medical setbacks. Isabella continued working with Gabriel throughout Carolina's recovery, and the bond between them deepened into something that felt almost like the parent-child relationship that Gabriel desperately needed given his mother's abandonment and his father's emotional distance. Gabriel started calling Isabella regularly outside of their scheduled tutoring sessions just to talk about his day or share something funny or ask advice about a problem he was facing, treating her as a trusted confidant and guide rather than just as hired help or another adult authority figure to resist and rebel against. Isabella welcomed this expanded role even though it went beyond her official job description, understanding that Gabriel needed stable, consistent adult presence, and that building this kind of relationship was actually the most important work she could do, regardless of whether it fit neatly into professional boundaries or tutoring contracts. Leonardo observed the deepening connection between Isabella and Gabriel, with mixed feelings of gratitude that his son had found someone who genuinely cared about him, and jealousy that Gabriel seemed more comfortable opening up to Isabella than to his own father, despite Leonardo's recent attempts to be more emotionally present and engaged. Isabella noticed Leonardo's discomfort and made efforts to encourage Gabriel to give his father chances to connect and to help Leonardo understand better how to communicate with his son in ways that felt supportive rather than critical or distant. assistant. She served as a kind of interpreter and bridge between father and son, helping them begin to understand each other's perspectives and to build trust and authentic relationship after years of disconnection and mutual disappointment. It was slow, delicate work that required enormous patience and careful attention to both Gabriel's needs for safety and consistency and Leonardo's fear of vulnerability and rejection, but gradually progress was made as they learned to talk more honestly and spend time together doing activities that actually interested Gabriel rather than activities Leonardo thought appropriate or educational. The romantic relationship between Leonardo and Isabella developed very slowly over the year following Carolina's transplant as they both navigated complex feelings and practical considerations about whether it was appropriate or wise for an employer and employee to become romantically involved, especially when the employee's primary role was caring for the employer's child. Isabella was particularly concerned about power dynamics and about how a romantic relationship might affect her ability to advocate effectively for Gabriel's needs if those needs conflicted with what Leonardo wanted or expected. Leonardo worried that his feelings for Isabella might be confusing gratitude and admiration with genuine romantic love, and that pursuing a relationship might complicate the family dynamics that were finally beginning to stabilize and heal after years of dysfunction. But despite all their careful caution and reasonable concerns, the attraction and connection between them continued growing stronger until it became impossible to ignore or dismiss as just friendship or professional partnership. The moment when they finally acknowledged what was happening between them came during a family trip that all three of them took together to the beach house that Leonardo owned, but rarely visited because he was always too busy with work to take actual vacations. The trip had been Gabriel's idea, suggested during a family therapy session that Leonardo had reluctantly agreed to attend after Isabella gently but firmly insisted that addressing his own emotional patterns and parenting approach was essential if he genuinely wanted to improve his relationship with his son. Gabriel had asked whether Isabella could come along on the vacation because he wanted to show her the beach and teach her to surf, and Leonardo had agreed, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, seeing this as opportunity to spend extended time with Isabella in a more relaxed context outside of the formal tutoring sessions and hospital visits and family therapy appointments that had defined most of their interactions. The beach vacation was remarkable for its simple ordinariness and lack of drama or crisis. Just three people who cared about each other spending time together walking on the beach and cooking meals and playing games and talking about everything and nothing with the kind of ease that comes from genuine affection and trust. Gabriel seemed happier and more relaxed than Leonardo could remember seeing him in years, and even Leonardo found himself unwinding and laughing and being present rather than constantly checking his phone or thinking about work obligations. On the last evening of the trip, after Gabriel had gone to bed early, exhausted from a full day of surfing and beach activities, Leonardo and Isabella sat together on the deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. And Leonardo finally gathered courage to tell Isabella what he had been feeling for months, but hadn't known how to express without risking everything they had built together. Leonardo told Isabella honestly that he had fallen deeply in love with her, not just because she was beautiful and intelligent and kind, though she was all those things, but because she had fundamentally changed who he was as a person and as a father, and had shown him through her example what it meant to live with authenticity and compassion, rather than just accumulating wealth and status and achievements that meant nothing without genuine human connection. He acknowledged that pursuing a romantic relationship would complicate things and might create challenges, especially regarding her professional role with Gabriel, but that he couldn't continue pretending he felt only professional appreciation, when what he actually felt was desire to build a life with her and to be the kind of partner who supported her dreams and challenges the way she had supported him and his son through their own journey of healing and growth. He made clear that he wasn't expecting an immediate answer or putting pressure on her to reciprocate his feelings, that he valued her presence in their lives regardless of whether romance was possible, and that Gabriel's needs and their ability to continue supporting his development had to remain the priority, whatever happened between the two adults. Isabella listened to Leonardo's confession with visible emotion, and when he finished speaking, she was quiet for several long moments while she processed everything he had said and considered how to respond honestly without minimizing the complexity of the situation. Finally, she told Leonardo that she had developed strong feelings for him as well over the months of working together and getting to know him beyond his wealthy, successful businessman persona, that she had watched him transform from emotionally closed off and focused only on achievement into someone capable of vulnerability and genuine caring, and it had been beautiful and moving to witness that evolution. She admitted that she had been fighting against her romantic feelings because she worried about power dynamics and about how a relationship between them might affect Gabriel and about whether Leonardo's feelings were genuine or just trauma bonding and gratitude for what she had done for Carolina and for his relationship with his son. She said she needed time to think carefully about whether pursuing romance was wise or whether it would potentially damage the genuine friendship and partnership they had built, and that she wanted to talk with Gabriel about his feelings and concerns before making any decisions, since his well-being had to be central consideration. Gabriel, when consulted the next day in a conversation where both Isabella and Leonardo were admirably honest and age-appropriate about the situation, was absolutely delighted at the prospect of his two favorite adults potentially becoming a couple, and immediately started talking about how Isabella could move into the apartment, and they could be a real family, and he would have both a father who was actually present and engaged, and a parental figure in Isabella who understood and supported him. His enthusiasm was touching, but also concerning because both Leonardo and Isabella recognized they needed to move carefully and not make promises about family structure and permanence until they were certain the romantic relationship could actually work long-term. They decided to try dating officially while maintaining some boundaries and being thoughtful about how they integrated romantic relationship with their existing connections to Gabriel and their complex history of employer-employee and tutor-student dynamics. The dating period was simultaneously wonderful and challenging as they navigated the transition from professional relationship to romantic partnership, while also ensuring Gabriel didn't feel neglected or displaced by the adult relationship. They were thoughtful about not displaying excessive physical affection in front of Gabriel or making him feel like the dynamic had shifted away from prioritizing his needs, but they also included him naturally in many of their dates and outings so he could see healthy adult relationship modeled and could feel part of the evolving family structure. They maintained boundaries around Isabella's professional tutoring role to ensure Gabriel's academic support continued without getting confused with the romantic relationship, and they were honest with each other about concerns and challenges as they arose rather than pretending everything was perfect or assuming love would automatically solve all the complex family dynamics and logistical considerations. After approximately 6 months of serious committed dating where they learned to navigate challenges and build genuine partnership, Leonardo proposed to Isabella in a thoughtful way that honored both the seriousness of their commitment and the journey they had traveled together. He asked not just Isabella, but also Gabriel and Carolina for their blessing and support, making clear that he was hoping to join their family and community rather than expecting Isabella to simply merge into his wealthy world and abandon her own roots and relationships. The wedding was a celebration that brought together Leonardo's business associates and old friends, many of whom had never seen him genuinely happy, and Isabella's extended family and community, including many of Carolina's friends from the social work world and patients she had helped over the years, creating beautiful mixing of different worlds and demonstrating that love could indeed bridge divides of class and background when people approached each other with respect and openness. Today, 4 years after that September morning when Isabella nervously arrived at Leonardo's penthouse to tutor his troubled son while hiding her own desperate struggles with her sister's illness, Leonardo and Isabella are happily married, and have created a blended family that also includes Carolina, who lives in a separate apartment nearby but is closely integrated into their daily lives and serves as another loving adult figure for Gabriel, who now calls her Aunt Carolina. Gabriel is 17 now and thriving academically and socially, planning to attend university to study education or social work so he can help other kids who are struggling like he once did. Transformed by the love and stability Isabella brought into his life, Leonardo has fundamentally changed his priorities and approach to both work and life, now leaving the office at reasonable hours to actually spend time with family, volunteering regularly with educational nonprofits that serve low-income students, and using his wealth to fund scholarships and programs rather than just accumulating more for himself. The deepest truth of this story isn't just about personal transformation or romance or overcoming class differences, though those elements are certainly important and central to the narrative. The real lesson is about how genuine human connection requires vulnerability and willingness to see each other's full humanity beyond the roles and functions we play in each other's lives, about how the people we hire to provide services, whether tutoring or caregiving or any other work, are complete human beings with their own struggles and dreams and needs for support, rather than just being instruments to solve our problems. It teaches us that wealth and success mean nothing if we're emotionally disconnected and unable to form authentic relationships with the people in our lives, including our own children, that sometimes the person you hire to help your child ends up being the one who actually teaches you how to be a better human being and parent. This story reminds us that trauma and abandonment require patience and consistent loving presence to heal, rather than just pressure and demands for immediate behavioral change, that children who are acting out are usually expressing pain and need rather than just being difficult or defiant for no reason. It shows us that being a good parent requires showing up emotionally and being vulnerable enough to really know and be known by your children rather than just providing material support and assuming that's sufficient. Most fundamentally, it teaches that opening your heart to genuine connection with others always involves risk of pain and loss, but that living in defensive disconnection trying to avoid vulnerability is actually a form of slow death that leaves us isolated and empty no matter how much external success we achieve. If this story touched your heart and made you think about the relationships in your own life, and whether you're showing up authentically or hiding behind roles and defenses, please leave a like on this video to let me know this content resonates with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about transformation and healing, about learning to be vulnerable, about seeing the people around us as full human beings worthy of care and respect. And please share in the comments your own experiences with teachers or mentors who changed your life, or times when opening yourself to genuine connection despite the risks brought unexpected joy and meaning, because your stories inspire all of us to be braver about loving and more generous about seeing each other's full humanity.